Hi, I'm Ken Fox, Head of Library and Archives at the George Eastman Museum's Richard and Rone Menschel Library. This discussion of Race, Women, and Uplift, the Colored Players Film Corporation, contains a number of late 19th and early 20th century illustrations, photographs, and films that are, without question, degrading and anti-Black. But as painful as we may find these images, understanding white supremacist visual culture is also essential to understanding race films and the remarkable achievements of the people who made them. And so, as hurtful as these racist materials may be, I hope to present them with discretion, sensitivity, and sufficient historical context. Projected motion pictures made their commercial U.S. debut in the spring of 1896 at Coster and Biles Music Hall in New York City. They appeared eighth on a vaudeville bill that also included a Russian clown, an eccentric dancer, and a trio of Australian tumblers who used their bodies to form letters of the alphabet. The demonstration of the projecting vitascope, which was billed as famous inventor Thomas Edison's latest marvel, came right before intermission, and it was likely regarded more as a novelty than as a new medium that would transform American culture, economics, and industry throughout the century to come. The Vitascope program for that evening included a series of short films demonstrating an umbrella dance, a butterfly dance, and burlesque boxing, acts not unlike the performances that would appear live on the music hall stage. But the program also featured views of ocean waves crashing on the shore, gondolas in Venice, and Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany reviewing his troops, ostensibly objective views that appear to present the world simply as it is, and history as it happens. And within months of this first Vitascope program, black faces began to appear on American motion picture screens. Cinema emerged just as the U.S. Supreme Court was deliberating Plessy versus Ferguson. The ruling would be handed down less than a month after the Vitascope's debut at Coster and Biles, and it would set the stage for 60 years of lawful segregation and Jim Crow laws in the United States. Considering the tenor of the times and the popular culture that reflected and encouraged anti-Black policymaking, it may come as a surprise that the earliest cinematic images of Black people were not the burnt cork insults of the black-faced minstrel show or the angry, degrading stereotypes popularized by Southern plays and fiction. They were, rather, the faces of real Black men and women engaged in seemingly ordinary activities. In his seminal history, Slow Fade to Black, The Negro in American Film, 1900 to 1942, Black film historian Thomas Cripps argues that during cinema's earliest years, before developments such as editing, camera movement, and narrative structures enabled racist distortions, Blacks, quote, suffered less than in other media, end quote. Thanks to what Cripps describes as the sheer primitiveness of movie technique, Black subjects were spared racist distortion at the hands of white producers. Cripps claims that these first unformed moving images were more objective, more repertorial, and they would survive as long as movie making, quote, consisted of no more than a single camera upon a tripod recording the objective reality before it without artifice, staging, or editing, end quote. Without imposed characterization and scripted narrative, Cripps believes these early moving images of Black Americans were naturally more authentic, more honest, and more dignified. By way of example, Cripps points to the 30-second actuality The Morning Bath, shot by the Edison Manufacturing Company in 1895, in which a Black woman does little more than bathe a Black baby for the camera. Cripps also mentions Edison's later colored troops disembarking, shot in 1898, year of the Spanish-American War. Running a mere 45 seconds, the average running time for these early reels, the film shows soldiers of the 2nd Battalion of the 24th Colored Infantry upon their return from Cuba, where a victory over Spain would help establish the U.S. as a major imperial power. The soldiers are seen leaving the commercial steamer Mascot, docked in Tampa, Florida. At first glance, and looking only at the films themselves, Cripps is correct. These short films appear to present Black subjects in unscripted, relatively natural circumstances. But slow it down a bit and look closer, and it's obvious the woman bathing the baby is taking direction from someone outside the frame. Draw back for a much wider, more figurative shot, one taking in the visual culture of the moment when American audiences would have first seen this film, and we see our subject and her baby enmeshed in a complex anti-Black discourse involving race, skin color, and hygiene. The comic theme of a person with a darker complexion being washed clean goes back as far as Aesop's fables, and a version of this tale appears in John Bunyan's widely read and enormously influential 1678 Christian allegory, The Pilgrim's Progress. And the motif of black being washed white would have been well known to 19th century readers thanks to William Godwin's inclusion of a version of the story titled Washing the Blackamoor White in his popular 1805 collection, Fables Ancient and Modern. In this telling of the tale, a, quote, very foolish woman, end quote, White, according to William Mulready's engraving as well as the logic of the narrative, thinks her black footman's skin color is the result of neglect and poor hygiene, and she attempts to wash him white. She fails, and in some versions of the tale, the black man, usually a slave, dies as a result of aggressive scrubbing in cold water. The intended moral of the story is similar to a leopard can't change its spots. However, if you're an enterprising marketer of detergents, you might argue the very foolish white woman was simply using the wrong brand of soap. As we can see in these two trade cards from the Buffalo, New York-based company Louts Brothers Company's soaps, the visual motif at the center of the fable is repeated as an advertising gimmick. Using Louts Brothers soap, you can wash the blackamoor white. Several other soap companies use the image as well, including Cook's Lightning soap. In other Cook's ads, lightning is spelled lightening. In the advertising card on the left, the character being washed is Jim Crow himself, and blatantly racist language and dialect is used to describe his ordeal. But it was England's Pears soap that was responsible for the widest dissemination of racist advertisements incorporating the motif of a black baby being washed white, or clean. Founded in 1802, Pears was the pioneer of modern brand-focused advertising, and their ad campaigns were hugely influential, both with other manufacturers and on the public discourse surrounding race and cleanliness. By 1895, when Edison's motion picture camera captured the uncredited black woman bathing a crying black baby, audiences would have been attuned to the racist joke that circulated around it. And perhaps the punchline is there on screen after all. The baby, of course, remains black, but the snowy suds with which the woman is directed to cover its head and body appear to turn his skin white. Similarly, a broader view of colored troops disembarking, a view that includes the advertising materials the Edison Manufacturing Company produced to sell the film to distributors and exhibitors, also reveals a racist frame. In the Edison Films Wars Extra Catalog, dated May 20th, 1820, the film is described in terms that play into derogatory fish-out-of-water humor, tied to the very idea of a black soldier. The catalog copy reads, "The steamer Mascot has reached her dock at Port Tampa, and the 2nd Battalion of Colored Infantry is going ashore. Tide is very high, and the gangplank is extra steep, and it is laughable to see the extreme caution displayed by the soldiers clambering down. The commanding officer struts on the wharf, urging them to hurry." It's worth noting that no other films listed in the War Extra, or the white soldiers they feature, are described as laughable. As historian Jane Hurley has noted, during the Spanish-American War, the commercial steamer Mascot had been converted into a hospital ship, used to transport wounded soldiers, some of whom were stricken with highly contagious yellow fever, from Cuba to Florida. The boat had also been used to transport Cuban refugees, and it appears from Edison's footage, segregated black soldiers. Returning from an armed conflict, these men, burdened with packs and weapons, were undoubtedly tired, possibly sick or wounded. Reading the Edison Company's catalog description, however, one would think the film of their unsteady arrival home a slapstick comedy. However much Thomas Cripps may neglect to take into account the racist cultural discourse framing these early films, he is absolutely right about the worsening of racial stereotypes in the considerably longer films of the Nickelodeon era, which can be said to begin in 1905. For an example of this development, one need look no further than the cinematic evolution of one of the more bizarre yet enduring racist tropes, Black people's fondness for watermelon, that sweet, inexpensive, hydrating fruit which had long been a staple among Southern agricultural workers, Black and white. As historian William R. Black has written, with emancipation, the watermelon had become an emblem of Black freedom and proud self-sufficiency outside the plantation system. Many formerly enslaved people grew, ate, and sold watermelons, often on street corners and at the kind of watermelon market pictured here in this 1866 engraving from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. However, by 1869, when what William Black believes to be the earliest caricature of Black people gorging on watermelon appeared, also in Leslie's illustrated newspaper, meanings had changed. Southern whites, threatened by the prospect of newly enfranchised Blacks voting en masse, had by then twisted this emblem of empowerment into a symbol of, as William Black writes, quote, Black people's perceived uncleanliness, laziness, childishness, and unwanted public presence, end quote. They were often depicted as children, or adults behaving like children, and children surely had no place at the ballot box. By 1896, the year of Edison's watermelon contest, a film in which two Black men raced to see who could eat a slice of watermelon fastest was anything but unformed, innocent, or objective. It obviously drew on those racist caricatures, and the film actually shocked white audiences who were offended, not by the racism, but by the spitting and drooling, a fact the Edison Company included in their sales catalog description of the film, ironically calling the men members of the colored gentry, and cynically noting that, quote, this film caused a furor in New York, end quote. But a mere 19-second film could do little more than play into the racist visual tropes involving watermelons, and considering the title, the willingness for poor black men to degrade themselves in a contest. By 1905, however, when the average running time of a film began to near the 10-minute mark, cinematic storytellers like the Edison Motion Picture Company could do much worse. With the development of editing, camera movement, scripted narrative, and screen acting, black characters could be characterized as thieving, foolish, childlike, and cowardly. Even more dangerous, Edison's 1905 The Watermelon Patch introduces the theme of white-on-black vigilante violence, as a group of white farmers put an end to the watermelon thievery and quite possibly the lives of the thieves themselves. They follow the offenders to a small wooden cabin, nail the door shut, then block its smoking chimney. Played strictly for laughs, The Watermelon Patch is an early nadir of racist filmmaking. As Thomas Cripps argues, cinema's rapid technological and narrative growth allowed for the kind of anti-black distortions that had long been staples of Southern plantation plays and literature. And these characterizations would be part of American cinema for decades to come. Black filmmaker Donald Vogel offers a typology, the subservient Uncle Tom, named after the title character in the novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The absurd, dandified coon, the tragic mulatto, unaware of her mixed race heritage or desperately trying to hide it. The jolly, desexualized mammy, who is more devoted to the white household than her own family. And the bestial, hypersexualized, brutal black buck. By 1915, each of these stock characters would have been smoothly integrated into the American cinematic tradition and become familiar to movie-going audiences across the country. And each would feature prominently in D.W. Griffith's monumental motion picture, The Birth of a Nation, undeniably one of the most important films ever made in terms of its synthesis of innovative film form and grammar, and one of the most unabashedly anti-black in terms of its content. With a running time of over 3 hours and initially accompanied by a full orchestra, The Birth of a Nation was a far cry from the silent 45 seconds of Edison's earliest projected films. And so were the film's presentation of black characters. These were the burnt cork insults of the 19th century minstrel show. Aside from extras who are mostly used in crowd scenes, all the major black characters in The Birth of a Nation were played by white actors in blackface. Consistent with Griffith's distorted depiction of the Civil War as a just and noble lost cause fought to preserve the Southern way of life, and his consideration of Reconstruction as, quote, the agony the South endured that a nation might be born, end quote, these black characters are all, without exception, played to these familiar, degraded, and dehumanized types. The faithful Tom, the preening coon, the rotund and comical mammy, the mulatto, though more treacherous than tragic, and the brutal black buck Gus, who joins the Union Army and is described as a renegade Negro. It is Gus's sexual rapacity that threatens the purity of Southern womanhood, a common metaphor in plantation literature for the South itself, and triggers the film's climactic ride of the Ku Klux Klan. Infamously, Griffith presented the Klan not as the domestic terrorists they were and continue to be, but as the heroic defenders of white supremacy, Southern honor, and the tragic nobility of the Confederate lost cause. Premiering only 20 years after commercial cinema made its public debut, The Birth of a Nation stands as the proverbial elephant in the room of American cinema, an irrefutable masterwork that is at once an astonishing cinematic achievement and a monumental embarrassment. The film has had its defenders among historians, many of whom argue that Griffith was merely a man of his time. He was, they are quick to point out, a white man born in the South during the tumult of Reconstruction and raised on a steady diet of plantation tradition kitsch and lost cause propaganda, including pulpy melodramas and plays, mass-produced sentimental art and photographs, and cheap, hastily erected Confederate statues. But Griffith's repellent portrayal of Black and mixed-race characters cannot be conveniently excused as popular entertainment reflecting the tenor of its times. For all its scope and grandeur, The Birth of a Nation is, at its very heart, a simple and simple-minded argument in favor of the disenfranchisement of Black Americans and a nostalgic look backwards to a mythic way of life that had ended 50 years earlier in a cataclysmic civil war. Much has been said about how Griffith's heroic treatment of the Ku Klux Klan led directly to the resurrection of that newly emboldened organization. Less widely known is the strong reaction the film caused among audiences, Black and white, who found the film's racism repugnant and its historical distortions misleading and dangerous. The NAACP, founded only 6 years earlier, was jolted into action. It helped organize protests in cities where The Birth of a Nation was scheduled to be shown. And as historian Steven Weinberger has argued, the coast-to-coast release of the film elevated the NAACP from an organization focused primarily on issues involving southern and border states to one of national stature. And in these organized street protests, we find the seeds of direct action engagement that would become a defining feature of the civil rights movement in the decades to come. Even President Woodrow Wilson, who was said to have praised Griffith's achievement as, quote, writing history with lightning, end quote, made an effort to distance himself from the film. Presented with a petition condemning The Birth of a Nation as anti-Black propaganda, the Wilson administration claimed the president had been unaware of the content of the film and permitted a screening at the White House only at the behest of his old Johns Hopkins University classmate, Thomas Dixon, upon whose novel and stage play Griffith based the film. And there was a cinematic response as well, originating in the Black community itself. As Thomas Cripps writes, The Birth of a Nation, quote, turned the attention of a few Afro-Americans towards cinema as a means of expression, and stimulated a distinctly Black cinematic rebuttal, end quote. Cripps is specifically referring to a 1918 production pointedly titled The Birth of a Race, a would-be epic that had an epically troubled production history. The film was originally the brainchild of Emmett J. Scott, a close aide and advisor to Booker T. Washington at the Tuskegee Institute. Scott described his original vision for the film as, quote, the true story of the Negro, his life in Africa, his enslavement, his freedom, his achievements, together with his past, present, and future relations with his white neighbor, end quote. Unfortunately, Washington's death, a misbegotten alliance with the Selig Polyscope Company, and a host of other mishaps resulted in a strange biblical pastiche that Cripps describes as, quote, a rambling, falsely pious melange that ignored its racial premises, end quote. 2 years after the betrayal of Scott's vision, however, a motion picture did appear that would not only provide a devastating counter-narrative to Griffith's slander, but endure as one of the great films of American cinema. Released on January 12, 1920, after a months-long dispute with the Chicago Board of Censors, Within Our Gates was written, directed, produced, and distributed by Oscar Micheaux, a Black novelist turned filmmaker. Micheaux had made his directorial debut the year earlier with an adaptation of his own novel based on his experiences as a homesteader in South Dakota. Within Our Gates was less autobiographical, but very much rooted in the violence of the moment, particularly Chicago's so-called Red Summer of 1919, when long simmering racial tensions exploded in violent attacks that left 15 whites and 23 blacks dead. Though Micheaux downplayed the influence of Griffith's film on his own masterwork, Within Our Gates is regarded as a powerful response to the birth of a nation. Several unforgettable scenes directly mirror Griffith's, including a harrowing dramatization of sexual violence, though this time the violence is white on black, and a climactic moment of vigilante violence and lynching that, unlike Griffith's ride of the Ku Klux Klan, is anything but heroic. But what is arguably most revolutionary about the film's content is Micheaux's portrayal of the so-called New Negro, a modern type of Black American who was originally theorized in the mid-1890s as an alternative to those derogatory Old Negro stereotypes of white supremacist discourse. Unlike the Old Negro, the New Negro was sophisticated, respectable, and perhaps most importantly, educated, either vocationally trained or schooled in the values of high European culture. According to a dominant strain of the theory, the new Negroes would constitute an important leadership class instilled with a sense of noblesse oblige and would work to uplift the less fortunate members of the race. By 1920 and the premiere of Micheaux's film, uplift and how to best achieve it had long been a hotly contested debate among Black intellectuals, but it was generally agreed that education, economic independence, and adherence to strict codes of respectable conduct were the key. Exactly whose notion of respectability, however, was left an open question. In Within Our Gates, Southern Black school teacher Sylvia Landry, played by the pioneering Black stage and screen star Evelyn Prier, travels north to raise money for a struggling school for poor Black children. Her intelligence, honesty, compassion, and poise eventually earn her the patronage of a wealthy white benefactor, and Sylvia saves the school. Though she is ultimately revealed to be of mixed race, a theme which would remain an important motif throughout Micheaux's body of work, Sylvia is no tragic mulatto, nor does she fit any of the other racist stereotypes audiences would have been accustomed to seeing on screen. Desiring and desired, and devoted to the care and education of Black children, Sylvia is the polar opposite of the desexualized faithful Mammy figure, who lavishes attention on her master's white children at the expense of her own. Sylvia is an exemplar of what was known as a race woman, a figure of racial pride and power. As Assata Shakur tells us, race men and women were, quote, loyal members of the Black race who dedicate their lives to directly contributing to the betterment of Black people, end quote. And like her real-life counterparts, Sylvia is the embodiment of racial uplift. Despite the timing and some narrative and visual parallels, we would be mistaken to ascribe the emergence of this separate Black cinema as solely a reaction to Griffith's film. Years before The Birth of a Nation, Black and white filmmakers had already recognized the potential of the motion picture medium, and they saw the possibility of developing a cinema that would appeal to Black audiences, a cinema that would ideally offer a more honest and authentic portrayal of Black lives. As we can see in the recently discovered 29-second film Something Good, Negro Kiss, produced by Selig Polyscope, the same company that would, ironically, help sink Emmett J. Scott's vision for The Birth of a Race 20 years later, Positive cinematic images of Black life and love were being produced as early as 1898. The actors Saint Suttle, also a well-known composer, and the 22-year-old Gertie Brown were half of the Ragtime Four, a short-lived Chicago vaudeville act famous for the cakewalk, a traditionally black dance with a sly, subversive edge. Suttle and Brown are dressed in their cakewalking costumes, but there's nothing racist or particularly stereotypical in their presentation. They are simply recreating the Edison Company's famous 1896 film, The Kiss. They just happen to be doing it while being black. In 1910, the black photographer and filmmaker Peter Jones and his brother Bill began producing comedies and would later form both the Peter P. Jones Film Company and the Seminole Film Producing Company. The same year, William D. Foster, a black filmmaker and journalist who wrote under the byline Julie Jones Jr., founded the Foster Photoplay Company in Chicago. Though the company wouldn't produce its first film, The Railroad Porter, until 1913, Foster is considered to be the first black man to form his own production company. In a 1913 interview with the black newspaper, the Indianapolis Freeman, Foster observed that the black man was beginning to, quote, weigh the import and calculate the value of the motion picture as a medium for portraying the finer and stronger features of his particular life. Our white brother is born blind and unwilling to see the finer aspects and quality of American Negro life. We must be up and doing for ourselves in our own best way and for our own best good, end quote. And for Foster, it wasn't only about fair representation, but fair business. The motion picture is here to stay, he would go on to say. And quote, the Negro is sure to be part of the work and certain to reap his portion of the reward, end quote. And while hardly a small independent studio, in 1913, the Biograph Company produced the extraordinary Limekiln Club Field Day, starring the great black entertainer Bert Williams. Believed to be the oldest surviving feature starring an all-black cast, the Limekiln Club Field Day remained undiscovered and unreleased until the Museum of Modern Art restored the film a century later. With its rich scenes of authentic Black life and characters who defy ugly stereotypes, it stands as a fascinating evidence of an empowering Black cinema produced by Biograph, the very same studio that was home to D.W. Griffith in the years before The Birth of a Nation. The presentation of free Black Americans working and respectively enjoying their leisure time in films like The Limekiln Club Field Day implied a certain level of social and economic advancement, not to mention middle-class decorum. But even earlier, major Black institutions were already using motion pictures to explicitly promote racial uplift and the means by which it may be attained. As Allison Nadia Field has written in Uplift Cinema, the emergence of African American film and the possibility of Black modernity, quote, the birth of a nation may have brought the issue of the filmic representation of African Americans to national attention, but leaders of the Uplift Project had already been using motion pictures to disseminate the message of agriculture and industrial training for several years. As early as 1910, moving pictures were integral parts of the uplift campaigns of the Hampton and Tuskegee Institutes, end quote. Many production companies advertising all Black casts appearing in films made for Black audiences, what would soon come to be called race films, would be founded in the years to come. With rare exceptions, like Oscar Micheaux's relatively long-lived Micheaux Film Corporation, which produced over 44 films between 1918 and its closure in 1940, most companies lasted a few years at best. Some produced a handful of films before going belly up. Others, it appears, never managed to complete a single feature, though company records are scarce and productions hard to confirm. Donald Bogle estimates there were 150 production companies producing race films between 1918 and 1940 alone. Prominent among them was the Lincoln Motion Picture Company of Los Angeles, though their original headquarters were in Omaha, Nebraska. The company was founded in 1916 by George Perry Johnson, a postal clerk, and his brother, the established actor Noble M. Johnson, who would soon be under contract with Universal Pictures. Aside from director and cinematographer Harry A. Gant, Lincoln was an all-black production unit, the first of its kind, and according to their publicity materials, they promised a, quote, high-grade motion picture featuring the race in photoplays of merit, minus all humiliating burlesque, end quote. And by all accounts, they delivered on this promise, beginning with 1916's The Realization of a Negro's Ambition, a tale of racial uplift in which a black Tuskegee graduate makes it big in the oil business. After producing only 4 additional films, the Lincoln Motion Picture Company was shuttered in 1923. Of the 5 films produced by the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, less than 5 minutes of its final production, By Right of Birth, survive. But in these few minutes, we can sense the potential the Johnson brothers saw in using motion pictures to disseminate uplifting images of Black men and women as educated, respectable, and economically successful middle-class Americans, enacting lives not unlike those of their white cinematic counterparts. However, not all companies were as interested in such refined portrayals, and in the case of the infamous Ebony Film Corporation of Chicago, humiliating burlesque was the order of the day. Originally founded in 1915 as the Historical Feature Film Company, Ebony traded in ugly stereotypes, and their slapstick comedies were often indistinguishable from the racist productions of more mainstream studios, featuring a predominantly white cast. According to Ebony's own publicity materials, theater patrons have, quote, waited long to see the inimitable humor of the Negro, and like the black-faced act, Ebony comedies meet with popular approval, satisfy any audience all of the time. Well, perhaps not all audiences. Far from satisfied, Black audiences and an excoriating Black press responded to Ebony's insulting output with considerable consternation and outrage. Though the company eventually installed Luther Pollard as president and general manager, Pollard was an advertising copywriter and the son of a Black Union soldier, Ebony Films was never able to successfully undo its reputation. And in 1919, it met the fate of so many other independent production companies. As motion pictures entered their 3rd decade, much had changed since the Edison Vitascope made its debut in New York's Herald Square. By the late teens, those production companies which had relocated to the West Coast had begun to coalesce into what would soon become the major Hollywood studios. And once prolific regional outfits like Chicago's S&A Film Manufacturing Company and Selig Polyscope, and Philadelphia's Lubin Manufacturing Company were either faltering or out of business altogether. As film historian Charles Musser has written, the closure of these studios resulted in a surplus of trained filmmaking talent, cast, crew, and producers who were now unemployed and looking for work. Also on hand was a new generation of professional Black actor who had performed with such prestigious all-Black theatrical companies as Chicago's Pekin Theater and later the Lafayette Players of New York City, which featured a roster of such bona fide stars as Charles S. Gilpin, Anita Bush, Lawrence Chanot, Evelyn Prier, Ida Anderson, and Edna Morton. It can be argued that, all told, this influx of talent resulted in a better class of race film, produced by such studios as the Oscar Micheaux Book and Film Company, the Norman Studios of Jacksonville, Florida, and New York's Real Productions, whose head, the London-born Jewish immigrant Robert Levy, had also managed the Lafayette Players. Precious few feature-length race films from the silent era survive. Due to the high cost of film processing, only a handful of prints were ever struck for each title, and those were subjected to not only the day-to-day abuses of the projection booth, but also the censor's scissors. Filmic representations of Black people that dared to go against the grain of racist stereotypes would also run afoul of local censor boards, particularly in southern states. To date, we can consider only 7 feature-length silent race films as being relatively complete, and considering the odds, it's a miracle even these few have survived. Luckily, 2 of these titles are complex and fascinating films produced by one of the finest studios to make race movies, the Colored Players Film Corporation of Philadelphia. As I mentioned, in the early 1920s, Philadelphia was home to a surplus of trained filmmaking talent, cast, crew, and producers who had been left behind by the 1916 collapse of the once mighty Lubin Manufacturing Company. Hollywood was by then the epicenter of the rapidly growing studio system, but as Charles Musser has written, thanks to this pool of personnel, Philadelphia became a hub of independent filmmaking, which included race films. The Colored Players founder, David Starkman, a self-educated Jewish-Austrian immigrant, was originally in the distribution and exhibition side of the business. He owned the city's Standard Film Exchange and was the proprietor of a local movie theater that catered to Philadelphia's Black audiences. And those audiences were substantial. According to a survey conducted in 1924, Philadelphia's Black population was the 2nd largest in the United States and was growing at an astonishing rate of 10,000 new arrivals each year, many of them relocating from the rural South. By 1930, the figure would stand at nearly 220,000, with only 30% Pennsylvania-born. Though white, Starkman was troubled by the derogatory Black stereotypes he saw in mainstream films, and he wanted to make quality movies with more accurate representations of his Black neighbors. So, in 1926, he sold his theater, secured investments from the city's white professional and merchant classes, and formed the Colored Players Film Corporation, in partnership with 2 other European American Jews, Louis Groner and Roy Kalmek, an industry veteran who had already directed at least 3 race films for Superior Art Motion Pictures Incorporated. Over the next 3 years, Colored Players would produce and distribute 4 films, each featuring an all-Black cast. A Prince of His Race and 10 Nights in a Barroom, both in 1926, Children of Fate from 1927, and The Scar of Shame, released in 1929. Of these 4 films, only 10 Nights in a Barroom and The Scar of Shame have survived. Both offer fascinating and revealingly ambiguous attitudes towards race women and racial uplift. By 1926, the year it was adapted by the Colored Players, 10 Nights in a Barroom would have been a well-known quantity to many of its audience members. Its source was an 1854 temperance novel, arguably the most famous of its kind, written by the American author Timothy Shea Arthur, who sensationally sermonized against the consumption of alcohol. Arthur's plainly written and influential stories appeared in monthly home magazines, where they promoted respectable middle-class domesticity, values, and beliefs, an uplift ideology for 19th century white folks. Temperance was chief among these beliefs, though 10 Nights in a Barroom also took on gambling and pulp romance novels as threats to bourgeois respectability. T.S. Arthur and the home magazine in general were great proponents of what critics would later term the cult of domesticity, according to which the roles of 19th century women were sharply delineated, limiting them to the domestic sphere, where, solid yet immobile, they served as the foundation, though not the head, of the middle-class family. As an advertisement for 10 Nights in a Barroom would later proclaim, such tales were designed to educate and amuse, warning against sin and transgression while offering consumers titillating displays of their shameful effects would time and again prove a winning formula for popular entertainment. And at mid-century, Arthur's novel is said to have rivaled only Uncle Tom's Cabin in popularity. 4 years after the novel's publication, William W. Pratt adapted Ten Nights in a Barroom into a phenomenally successful stage play, which remained in continuous production well into the 20th century, even after Prohibition rendered the text sermonizing moot. Scenes from Ten Nights in a Barroom were also adapted for Magic Lantern presentations. An important precursor to cinema, the Magic Lantern projected glass-mounted images onto a screen, and the technology had, by the second half of the 19th century, been widely used by churches, schools, and civic organizations to teach and preach, as well as entertain. Accompanied by a narrator, illustrated scenes from the Bible were particularly popular, as were morally edifying moments from popular melodramas like Uncle Tom's Cabin and Ten Nights in a Barroom. By 1926, Arthur's text had been filmed at least 9 times, including an unofficial 1909 adaptation from Biograph titled What Drink Did, and directed by none other than D.W. Griffith. Exactly why a company like the Colored Players Film Corporation would be attracted to a somewhat creaky, overly familiar mid-19th century temperance tale, one that featured no Black characters or concerned itself with anything specific to the Black community, is open to speculation. Consider also the fact that by 1926, Prohibition had been in effect for 6 years. Some justified the continual production of the play as a reminder of just why alcohol needed to be constitutionally banned, while others mocked the anachronism. Wondering in 1925 about a production of Pratt's play, mounted in some boondock theater, likely still lit by kerosene lamps, a Kansas critic asked rhetorically, "Why 10 nights in a barroom when there are no more barrooms?" He then responded, quote, "The answer seems to come with the recollection that Uncle Tom's Cabin is still a star attraction on the kerosene circuits, and slavery has been off the map for 60 years. It must be that certain people like their drama raw," end quote. Clearly, certain people and a taste for raw melodramatics couldn't have been what attracted Starkman, Kroner, and Kalnick, who would also direct the film. The Colored Players Film Corporation sought to provide Black audiences with a higher grade of race film, similar to what had been produced by Real Productions in New York City. Charles Musser argues that for the Colored Players, an all-Black adaptation of an all-American staple, like 10 Nights in a Barroom, served as, quote, "an assertion of American identity and full citizenship," end quote. Perhaps, but if we once again take a view through that wider cultural lens, the view that considers the ideological work done by the source text up to that point, whether on the page or stage, in a church hall or on a cinema screen, we can see how neatly T.S. Arthur's bourgeois Victorian values coincide with the ideals of racial uplift. Temperance rather than drunkenness, hard honest work instead of gambling, civic engagement over isolating dissipation, edifying literature like temperance novels themselves rather than cheap pulp fictions, hearth and home over the barroom. And in noting the convergence of these values, we must also ask, along with historian Kevin K. Gaines, the extent to which racial uplift ideology can be regarded as an independent Black perspective. Though pared down to the central conflict between the two former business partners, one of whom opens a barroom in which the other nearly destroys himself with alcohol, the Colored Players adaptation follows the overall structure of Arthur's novel, including its framing device. The film opens with 2 traveling salesmen, one a veteran of the circuit, who tells the other about the recent history of the quiet town in which they now find themselves, Cedarville, and how its fortunes quickly deteriorated once Simon Slade, played by Lawrence Chanot, one of Lafayette Players' most famous stars, opened the Sickle and Sheaf, his tavern in the Cedarville Hotel. Slade built the barroom using the proceeds from the sale of a mill he once co-owned with Joan Morgan, played by Charles S. Gilpin, another celebrated Lafayette player, and Eugene O'Neill's original Emperor Jones. Morgan knows he was cheated in the deal, and he now spends what little money he has left drinking in the bar room. Instead of caring for his neglected wife, Fanny, played by Myra Burwell, and their young daughter, who are both left home despairing. Drink isn't the only vice afoot at the Sickle and Sheaf. Upstairs, crooked games of poker are played, and the once respectable Willie Hammond, played by Harry Henderson, star of the Colored Players A Prince of His Race, is gambling away a future of respectable domesticity he hoped to share with Simon Slade's daughter. The very presence of the barroom inevitably brings out the worst in the residents of Cedarville, and the drama culminates in a moment of drunken violence and retribution that leaves the tavern in flames. Order is eventually restored and a lesson learned by all, including, it is hoped, the audience, but there is a curious ambivalence at the heart of the film. The ultimate threat, it becomes evident, isn't to the individual or the individual's soul, but to the middle-class community itself and its foundational unit, the family, headed by the father, but maintained at home by the mother. Aside from comic characters like Mehitable Cartwright, played by Arlene Mickey, one of Cedarville's as yet unmarried women whose own romantic prospects are threatened by her devotion to romantic dime novels, the wives, mothers, and daughters of Cedarville largely remain home where they care for their house and children. When not confined to the home, they travel about in groups, mobile only in numbers, commenting on the action like a Greek chorus or simply passively observing. Passive, that is, until violence threatens domestic stability. At their instigation, the group of women quickly grows into an angry mob of townsfolk whose fury cannot be contained. And like all mobs, its reaction is excessive and results in panic and death. While the women are clearly meant to serve as the moral center of the film, this combination of passivity and rage is hard to reconcile with any image of a racewoman, though we can't be sure what was originally intended. It's unclear from the surviving print what actually causes the destruction of the Sickle and Sheaf. The Colored Players' adaptation of 10 Nights in a Barroom leaves one feeling that the greatest argument against alcohol is not the moral ruin it causes, but the threat posed by the furious, however sober, mob of Carrie nations it incites. Ultimately, the film serves primarily as a warning against righteous mob violence, which would no doubt have particular resonance for Black audiences, but does not exactly align with racial uplift. An even more interesting ambivalence hangs over the Colored Players' fourth and final production, The Scar of Shame, released in 1929, but begun, it is believed, in 1927, at which point the company was under the leadership of a new president, Sherman Houston Dudley, a well-known Black showman and entrepreneur. Dudley, who went by the initials SH to forestall any unfamiliar white person from disrespectfully using his first name, came up on the late 19th century medicine show circuit. Later, Dudley joined the Smart Set, a Black vaudeville troupe known for its sophistication, though Dudley's most popular act paired him with a mule named Patrick. By 1911, Dudley had settled in Washington, D.C., where he focused on establishing a countrywide circuit of Black-owned entertainment venues. By 1916, S.H. Dudley Theatrical Enterprises had grown from 4 theaters in the Virginia, Washington, D.C. area to more than 20 Black-owned or operated venues across the Midwest and down into southern states on what became known as the Dudley Circuit. In 1920, the Dudley Circuit was absorbed into the better-known and even more extensive Theater Owners Booking Association, a lifeline for Black vaudevillians in the decade to come. Dudley had always been an advocate for race pictures. For a time, he was even under contract at Reel Productions. In 1922, he starred in Reel's black cast film Easy Money, in which he was billed as the world-renowned S.H. Dudley, the great colored star. There is some dispute as to when and why S.H. Dudley joined the Colored Players Film Corporation, but it is generally agreed that in 1927, the company underwent a reorganization, and Dudley was installed as president. Given that he's listed as a producer of The Scar of Shame, it's likely Dudley was also able to contribute the funds needed to defer financial ruin, an interesting reversal of the usual white-black financial paradigm. Unfortunately, Dudley's involvement, and the company itself, would be finished by the time the silent Scar of Shame was seen by most audiences. Though the film was met with critical acclaim and is today considered to be among the finest of all race films, the coming of sound and its expensive, specialized technology meant the end of the line for many small independent companies whose silent productions felt immediately outdated. In the tradition of popular social problem films of the period, The Scar of Shame opens with a direct address to the audience in the form of a foreword that scrolls up the screen and tells us what the film we are about to see is all about. Environment, surroundings, childhood training, and companions, it reads. That is what shapes our destinies. And without the benefit of a knowing, loving hand to keep the lamp of knowledge burning, then will come sorrow and shame. To the trained ear, it's the language of the ideology of racial uplift, exhorting Black community leaders and the educated elite to not only hold themselves to standards of respectability and high moral rectitude, but to assume responsibility for elevating those unfortunates below them. And make no mistake, those who are perceived to be below this Black elite are considered to be unfortunate and in dire need of help. But regardless of what the prologue tells us, what is The Scar of Shame really about? Ostensibly, it's the story of an ambitious young composer named Alvin Hilliard, played by Harry Henderson, who lives in a select Philadelphia area boarding house run by the respectable Lucretia Green, Anne Kennedy. Next door, the poor and uneducated, though strikingly beautiful, Louise Howard, Lucille Lynn Moses, dreams of escaping the drudgery of her lowly life and the brutality of her alcoholic stepfather, Spike, played by William E. Pettus. One afternoon, after witnessing Spike attempting to molest Louise, Alvin rushes to her rescue. Miss Green offers Louise refuge in the boarding house, and to keep her safe, Alvin impulsively proposes marriage, even though he knows his respectable and bigoted mother would never approve of such a match. Louise, impressed by Alvin's sophistication, readily agrees. They marry, but as Alvin sets about uplifting his bride by introducing her to the finer things, Eddie Blake, played by Norman Johnstone, one of Miss Green's less respectable tenants, plots with Spike to lure Louise away from Alvin and to put her to work in a nightclub. Educated and cultured in the European tradition and destined for success, Alvin is one of W.E.B. Du Bois's talented tenth, whom Du Bois defined as the best of the race, who will, quote, guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worst, in their own and other races. To urban audiences of 1929, Alvin would have been seen as the latest iteration of the aforementioned New Negro. Like George Bernard Shaw's Henry Higgins, Alvin regards Louise as a project. She's described as an apt pupil, an experiment that puts the ideology of uplift to the test. Given an environment free of economic hardship and vice and exposed to the refinements of Western culture, even the lowliest can be raised a bit higher up the ladder, high enough at least to be saved from what Du Bois saw as the worst. Black historian Kevin K. Gaines is highly critical of this particular strain of uplift ideology, as were some Black critics at the time. In his book, Uplifting the Race, Black Leadership, Politics, and Culture in the 20th Century, Gaines notes that facing legal and extra-legal repression, quote, many Black elites sought status, moral authority and recognition of their humanity by distinguishing themselves as bourgeois agents of civilization from the presumably undeveloped black majority. Hence the phrase, so purposeful and earnest, yet so often of ambiguous significance, uplifting the race, end quote. In other words, through the notion of uplift, the Black elite makes claims of racial progress by comparing itself to the lowly majority. The fact that uplift can be successful is admittedly an argument against white supremacist claims of Black biological inferiority, but it's made at the expense of continued denigration of the Black majority. The scar of shame goes one step further. It not only shows how much of uplift ideology is driven by an emphasis on class difference, but dramatically demonstrates how uplift can be ultimately thwarted by such classist attitudes that are held by Black elites. 3 months into her marriage to Alvin, Louise appears despondent. She has yet to meet her mother-in-law, and she begins to suspect that Alvin is ashamed of her low rank in society. The doll puppet Louise cradles in her otherwise empty lap points to another familial absence, a child. The breaking point comes when Louise discovers an old letter from Alvin's mother, in which Mrs. Hilliard, playing matchmaker, describes a romantic prospect as being, quote, a lady and really of our set, end quote. Louise's suspicions are confirmed. No matter how improved her environment, no woman of her base group, to use Louise's word for it, will ever be permitted to join Alvin on the high rung of the Black social ladder. More than anything else in the film, more than environment, more than the genetics, more than the machinations of Spike and Eddie, it is this intransigent hierarchy of class and caste that will doom her marriage and ultimately Louise herself. The film's explicit treatment of class not only situates the characters in relation to one another, but drives the plot forward to its troubling and highly ambivalent conclusion. It brings us at last to the film's most conspicuous absence, white society, the real dominant class. Like Mrs. Hilliard, whom we never see, it remains invisible. The total absence of white characters or any acknowledgement of the existence of a white world outside the Black world of the film allows the scar of shame, much like uplift ideology itself, to focus exclusively on class differences. But, as Gaines writes, this Black middle-class ideology remained, quote, trapped within that which it has denied, or tried to forget, that historically, the conditions for social mobility and class formation among all Americans have been circumscribed by race and color. Elite African Americans were replicating, even as they contested, the uniquely American racial fictions upon which liberal conceptions of social reality and equality were founded, end quote. Perhaps more than any other surviving race film, The Scar of Shame is complex and fascinatingly ambivalent. Despite the didactic tone of the preface, it doesn't really offer any answers, and this essential ambivalence may be, in the end, unresolvable. Many race films were first introduced to a new audience in the 1980s, when BET, the Black Entertainment Cable Channel, added a few to their programming schedule. Since then, film festivals and streaming video technology, not to mention ongoing preservation efforts at institutions like the George Eastman Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Library of Congress, have brought these often remarkable works to a much wider audience. The recent reappearance of revelatory works like the Lime Kiln Club Field Day and Something Good, Negro Kiss, offers hope that there are more race films to be discovered, more scholarship on the horizon. As we as a nation continue to struggle with our history and how the legacy of slavery and anti-Black violence continues to shape our present, these films offer a fascinating, often contradictory, but always entertaining lens through which we can view our past and ourselves.